So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome again to the Saturday Free School 5th anniversary. My name is Julian Thompson, and I'm really privileged to be able to moderate this afternoon panel on internationalism and intercivilizational unity. I also want to just thank the team of folks who've organized the conference, number one, for doing just a wonderful job with getting everything set up with the logistics and the food. In the environment. It's really been a great space to be able to participate in. And I just want to say thank you as well for the opportunity to moderate. I've only been going to free school for a couple of months, but have really felt inspired by being a part of this community. I thought I would start the kind of moderation today by talking about a moment of ideological dissonance that happened in my life. My first interaction with sort of the concept of Saturday Free School happened in January 2016. At that point, I was having a pretty relaxed Sunday. I got an invitation from a friend who was in town from Chicago. He said, "I'm in town for Chicago from today. Let's do lunch." That was great. We had a great time. And then afterward, he said, "Well, I think I'm going to spend the rest of my day at this conference in North Philly." And I was like, wow, you're going to a conference in North Philly with your only day in Chicago. Who are you going to go see? And he said, well, Angela Davis is going to be at this conference. And I said, well, wow, I can't believe she's in town. I don't know anything about it, but maybe I should go. And so I went. At that point in January 2016, I think I was pretty firmly a Barack Obama Democrat. I had a painting of Barack Obama on my wall at that time and felt strongly about his leadership of the country. And so it was a real moment to be able to hear from the thinkers at the conference that day. One of the things Angela Davis said toward the end of her speech is she cautioned the group. She said that the group should be aware of the limitations of nationalism. The limitations of nationalism in allowing Black Americans to understand and to participate in the role of the global struggle. When she said that, I kind of sat there and I thought about all the things that I had been taught and all the things that I had learned. And I was thinking about how much I respected Angela Davis and respected her background and tradition. And there's no other word to describe how I felt at that time except ideological dissonance. There was truth that I believed I had experienced in the world. There was truth I was hearing from Angela Davis. And I didn't have at that point a community or a group of people or a philosophical structure to reconcile those ideas in my head. I think that happens to people in our country and even the most eager people in our generation a lot. And that's what's made it so great to be a part of Free School and to be in a space that is committed to ideological clarity. So when I talk to people about what Free School is, that's a lot of times what I talk about. So then that kind of raised the question, as I thought about that Angela Davis quote and thought about some of the things I've learned in Free School in the last couple months, I've thought, kind of what makes ideological clarity so difficult in America? Why is it that the most curious, the most ambitious, the people who read every book, attend every seminar, still can't find their way toward what you might call the capital T truth about how America operates? Why is it that that's the case? And I think, the things that I've come to, and with the help of the Free School, is that the reason that ideological clarity is difficult in America is because America is a complex society that's designed to create a narrow mind. That's a quote from James Baldwin from the documentary I Am Not Your Negro. And when I heard that quote during the movie, it just hit me like a ton of bricks. A complex society built to create a narrow mind. So there's a primacy of capitalism in this country that forces us into a certain frame of thought about how we use our resources. There's a primacy of white supremacy that forces us to think about how we interact with each other along a certain paradigm. And then critically for this conversation, there's a primacy of nationalism the elevation of American values and American ethics above all others. What I'm hoping for through this panel is a conversation about ideological clarity on the question of internationalism and intercivilizational unity. White supremacy is a real focus of the Free School, and I'm really excited to figure out if we've highlighted that white supremacy is the main challenge of our time, then internationalism and intercivilizational unity could represent what's next, or could represent the response that the Free School should work for. In that question, I'm hoping that our panelists can help us figure out a few things. First, on the question of internationalism, what I ultimately think about most is, what are the principles of internationalism? Our president just dropped the largest non-nuclear bomb in the history of the world on another country. And I think that he might say that he dropped that bomb in the name of internationalism. And so when we talk about internationalism in Saturday Free School, how do we distinguish between our ethos and the ethos that we might hear from other members of American society? And then when I think about intercivilizational unity, I start to process a reflection that Baldwin made. Baldwin spoke in the 1950s at the Conference of Negro African Writers and Artists. And when he spoke there, he was reflecting on the fact that there were intellectuals from the colonized world, from America, from Europe. And he reflected that the group struggled with the question of whether their civilizations had a principle of unity beyond oppression, opposition to white supremacy. And so I'm really interested to think about the reflections of really this esteemed panel, because it'll help me clarify what is our unifying force, and based on what we believe that unifying force is, how do we proceed? I haven't had the chance to get to know our panelists as well as I might have liked, because I've only been a part of Free School for 2 months. But each of the 4 of them have really helped me in developing ideological clarity over the last 2 months. And so I'm really excited that they'll be presenting today. We have 4 panelists, starting to my right and your left. We have Brandon Doe, Jahanzaib Choudhry, Susan Abulhawa, and Djibo Sobukwe. I'm really excited that they're presenting. Can we give them a round of applause?
I'm very honored to be speaking on this panel on the topic of internationalism and intercivilizational unity. What I thought I would share with you is some brief thoughts on my experiences with this concept since I've been coming to the Free School. I'm also relatively new to it, and I'm also a very amateur student of this concept, so take what I say with a grain of salt. For me, I think one of the cornerstones of intercivilizational unity, and one of the main things I've gotten out of coming from the Free School, is a sense of the importance of radical optimism, something we find at the root of the work of James Baldwin. Radical optimism means believing in the potential of humanity while at the same time having a sober realization of the ugliness of our reality. It is a stubborn belief in the transformative potential of mankind. When it comes to the question of civilization, we must apply the same radical optimism. This is in contrast to the academic study of civilization, which focuses on complication and pessimism at the expense of identifying the liberatory potential of human society. I think in the society and the world we live in, we've seen enough of this intelligent pessimism. Too many people dismiss the idea of a better world, of a more ethical civilization, as naivete or cliché, as abnormal. And I think most of you will agree, in the era in which we live, it is the normal that has become the problem. the abnormal has become a necessity. When it comes to the question of understanding civilization, I think a correct understanding of intercivilizational unity means having a dialectical view of what civilization consists of. For example, going back to my experiences in doing South Asian-oriented organizing with Nandita and Meghna, we see within the civilizations of South Asia, as well as among the diaspora in the United States and elsewhere, that there are social relations that could be fairly characterized as casteist, patriarchal, and hierarchical. Yet at the same time, deep within these civilizations, as well as the folk cultures which they gave birth to, we see the radical egalitarianism of Sufi, Bhakti, and Sikh songs and poetry that indicate that within these civilizations are also the organic seeds of resistance. When we look out at the world in which we live in, we see that when it comes to the question of the non-white world, neo-colonialism and cultural essentialism and nationalism seem to have doomed the anti-imperialist project. But we must reject this kind of thinking. All that the state of the world tells us is that the project of anti-imperialism and the struggle against white supremacy is still left for us to finish. Similarly, when we look at the anti-blackness and fetishization of whiteness by non-white immigrants from the post-colonial world, this does not mean that the project of the civil rights movement and the project of Afro-Asian solidarity is doomed. It screams that the completion of these projects is in our hands. This is because radical optimism comes with a sense of radical responsibility. And this means the difficult work of organizing. And when it comes to intercivilizational unity, we must understand that it is the working class that is strategically located to disrupt the capitalist white supremacist order. We must oppose the politics of guilt and identitarianism which comes out of the academy and elsewhere for the politics of radical solidarity. Solidarity must start with a deep connection to each of our segments of the proletariat. We must realize that there is a stark difference between dismissing people as hopelessly problematic, in contrast to the necessity of seeing them as full of contradictions and at the same time full of possibilities. For those of us from communities that have come to this country and seem to aspire endlessly to consumerism and the fetishization of whiteness, it is counter-revolutionary for us to embrace the arrogance of call-out culture and its nihilism. For us, true solidarity with the black struggle must mean the opposite: to build deep links to our segments of the proletariat, to work with them through their contradictions and move them through the class struggle, to collectively recover our humanity and the liberatory aspects of our traditions, which is at the root of the black radical tradition. All of this is to say, we must organize with a sober analysis of race, class, and gender, of capitalism and white supremacy, but with the radical optimism of Baldwin and Du Bois, that the world can be transformed from a racist and capitalist order to a human one. As Dr. King said, we may not get to reach the mountaintop, but we can glimpse it. At the risk of sounding sentimental, I want to say that personally for me, the beautiful thing about the Free School and the work that we've done together is that there are definitely moments in our intercivilizational struggle when we can see and feel the promised land of human liberation. We are all here and we are all committed to struggle because we have a stubborn belief that it is possible for human eyes to one day witness the fulfilled potential of human civilization, whether we call it the mountaintop, the kingdom of God, nirvana, moksha, or communism. Thank you.
All right. First off, it is a great honor to speak here in the sanctuary finally. After being here for the first time during the Black Radical Tradition Conference when Emory Douglas was actually speaking here. And I believe in 1970, Fred Hampton also spoke right there. So I was introduced to the Saturday Free School about 2 years ago by my friend Rose, who is also was also a member of the Black Radical Organizing Collective, and she took me there. And the first time I came, I was just really amazed because in student activism, we're so used to being around other young people. We're so used to being around other people with the exact same or very similar values as us. But once I came to the Saturday Free School, I noticed that it was intergenerational. But also we came from many different backgrounds: Asian, East Asian, Southeast Asian, South Asian, African American, and I am not a person who is very acquainted with Black Philadelphia, although I am originally from Philadelphia. But one of the things I noticed is that this phrase that was used a lot by Dr. Montero and other members of the Saturday Free School as well, and it's "get down or lay down." And so I did a little bit of research, and I found out that this was a slogan that was first coined by the Philadelphia Black Mafia, and later popularized in the films State Property Volumes 1 and 2. And this is a slogan that best exemplifies the brutal hegemonic nature of the United States empire. When applied to the United States, it means that if you refuse to sell your soul and get down with your oppressor, you are rendered disposable and will be gotten rid of. Throughout the course of recent history, especially, we have seen this "get down or lay down" motto carried out by the United States against the rest of the world. We've seen it when Muammar Gaddafi, the former leader of Libya, planned to unite the countries of Africa through a gold currency, which would have weakened the US dollar and strengthened the economies of African civilizations. In 2011, under the Obama administration, Hillary Clinton funded terrorist rebels to overthrow the Libyan leader while simultaneously spearheading the massive NATO bombing of their country. Gaddafi's gruesome and inhumane death was shown all over Western media for the world to see. Since 2011, the country of Libya has been in a state of crisis, and it is now a terrorist stronghold with 3 separate governments. We've seen another example of this "get down or lay down" motto when, in 2009, Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, vetoed a plan by the Gulf countries to build an oil pipeline through Syria leading to the Mediterranean. It wasn't until recently that the United States has stopped funding and arming rebels to overthrow the Assad government that resulted in the killing of over 400,000 Syrian people. We've also seen this when Temple University displaces the Black and brown community of North Philadelphia who have been living here for generations in order to expand their neoliberal profit over people institution. The system of capitalism is in a state of crisis. It is a dying empire that requires war and the mass stealing of resources to survive. A recent article on the Black Agenda Report written by Danny Haifeng revealed that from 2007 to 2015, the global number of unemployment increased by over 27 million people. And in the United States, Black and brown people spend 50% of their income on rent alone. If history has taught us anything, it is that war abroad and mass suffering always equals to suffering at home as well. So, to the Middle East, one day prior to the Syrian government's alleged chemical attacks against its own people in Idlib, Warmonger Hillary Clinton came out of the woods after her humiliating and self-inflicted defeat by Donald Trump and stated that she still believes that the United States should implement a no-fly zone over Syria, in spite of the fact that it would inevitably result in the colliding of Russian and American jets, and that it would result in the death of thousands of more Syrian lives. Therefore, we cannot discuss Syria without addressing the impending war with Russia. Russia is a country that is home to over 140 million people and spans 5 different time zones. Prior to Trump's win, NATO stationed troops along with tanks and other high-grade military weapons in Afghanistan, Poland, and now Estonia, seemingly tying a noose around the country. They are now currently hiring Russian speakers to act as dummies in U.S. military drills. The mainstream anti-Trump movement has failed to back up any evidence that the elections were hacked by Russia in Trump's favor, and why Vladimir Putin deserves to be compared to Adolf Hitler. In addition, the fact that his mentor, Boris Yeltsin, won through a rigged election by the Bill Clinton administration is just one of the many examples of America's blatant hypocrisy. The manufactured boogeyman in the alt-right has sought to demonize an entire group of people, many who voted for Donald Trump due to his stance against NAFTA and non-U.S. intervention in Syria, because they are tired of losing jobs and they are tired of sending families off to fight in wars. Again, the manufactured boogeyman image and the quote-unquote fascist takeover by the alt-right have served as a distraction to the fact that fascism is already ingrained in the DNA of this country, or the fact that 80% of Ukrainians now live in poverty after the 2014 US-backed coup in support of actual neo-Nazi fascists. It is absolutely also worth noting that the US has also been instigating a nuclear war with with North Korea as well. These events indicate a desperation in the empire on their quest to achieve global hegemony. We must stand with the people of Syria, Russia, the Houthis in Yemen, the people of Ukraine, the people of Korea, and the people of Palestine as well. I believe that a new movement is required to bring down the system. However, it will require more than slogans and catchphrases to achieve this and to avoid another human catastrophe. The people of the world should be able to determine their own future. What we know for certain is that U.S. intervention deliberately prevents this from happening. I, for one, as an activist within the Palestine Solidarity Movement, am tired of the call-outs on both sides and the blacklisting. We are seated within the belly of the beast. Our obligation is to weaken this beast and ultimately slay it, because it has only represented the negation of humanity throughout the world. It is up to the people of Syria to decide who they want as their leader, and we know that they will not have the opportunity with the empire controlling it. Our first priority, first and foremost, should be to educate and to unite the people through material struggles. This means that we have to talk to people. This means that we have to talk to people, many who don't come from where we come from, people who don't look how we look, people who don't act how we act. We have learned that perhaps soldiers who were used in these imperialist wars can be in fact the most revolutionary. We must not forget that many members of the Black Panther Party, such as Geronimo Pratt, were U.S. veterans themselves. Members of the Saturday Free School come from all walks of life and backgrounds. We stress intercivilizational unity and principled unity, not based on simply our identity, but our common values for freedom, peace, and human liberation. Our views are always held accountable to the people, and we are able to build a collective out of love for the broader human struggle by bringing all of our experiences together to produce a greater knowledge for liberation. And Megna mentioned this in her speech, but I'm also going to go a little bit into revolutionary intercommunalism because it has definitely helped me a lot in understanding intercivilizational unity. So this is from Huey Newton's speech in 1970 at Boston College. A short time ago in Detroit, the community was under siege, and now 16 members of the party are in prison. The local police laid siege on that community and that house, and they used the same weapons they use in Vietnam. As a matter of fact, 2 tanks rolled up. The same thing happens in Vietnam because the police are there also. The police are everywhere, and they all wear the same uniform and use the same tools and have the same purpose: the protection of the ruling circle here in North America. It is true that the world is one community, but we are not satisfied with the concentration of its power. We want the power for the people. We've had long arguments with people about our convictions. Before we became conscious, we used to call ourselves a dispersed collection of colonies here in North America. And people argued with me all day and night long, how can you possibly be a colony? In order to be a colony, you have to have a nation, and you're not a nation, you're a community. You're a dispersed collection of communities. We are a collection of communities, just as the Korean people, the Vietnamese people, and the Chinese people are a collection of communities. A dispersed collection of communities because we have no superstructure of our own. The superstructure we have is the superstructure of Wall Street, which all of our labor produced. This is a distorted form of collectivity. Everything's been collected, but it's used exclusively in the interests of the ruling circle. This is why the Black Panther Party denounces black capitalism and says that all we can do is liberate our community, not only in Vietnam, but here, not only in Cambodia and the People's Republic of China and Korea, but the communities of the world. We must unite as one community and then transform the world into a place where people will be happy, wars will end, and the state itself will no longer exist, and we will have communism. But we cannot do this right away. When the transformation takes place, when structural change takes place, the result is usually cultural lag. After the people possess the means of production, we will probably not move directly into communism, but linger with revolutionary intercommunalism until such time as we can wash away bourgeois thought, until such time as we can wash away racism and reactionary thinking, until such time as people are not attached to their nation as a peasant is attached to the soil, until such time as that people can gain their sanity and develop a culture that is essentially human, that will serve the people instead of some god. Because we cannot avoid contact with each other, we will have to develop a value system that will help us function together in harmony. And with that being said, we are first and foremost members of a collective of human society and the broader global struggle. Regardless of the borders that divide us of our skin pigmentations, we are all soldiers in the people's war. Thank you.
So I've been with the Saturday Free School for over a year. I started after the Black Radical Tradition Conference. And as a Palestinian who has felt perpetually out of place in the world, my parents were refugees from the '67 war. We were kicked out of Kuwait. I was snuck into Jerusalem, kicked out of Jerusalem, then came to the U.S. and went from a series of foster homes. The idea of space is something I'm very sensitive to, and the sense of being out of place has been a persistent theme in my life. And I ended up in Yardley, Pennsylvania, of all places, one of the most terminally white Zionist spots you can imagine. So outside of my little garden and flowers that I've created at my house, the world around me is really not for me. So the Saturday School has been a kind of intellectual, political, and even psychological refuge for me. That's just having that physical space with people who are brilliant, people who are politically and socially aware, people who challenge me, who accept my challenges as well, and who have in many ways come to feel like a sort of family. So it has been a real enriching experience for me to be at the Saturday Free School. I actually was up this morning, like 5:30, thinking, "Oh my God, what am I gonna say?" And so I jotted down some thoughts, and I hope they're not too horribly disconnected. But I'm not I'm not a wing-it public speaker like many of the folks before me today. So I'm going to read, and I hope it won't bore you to death. But as I was writing, I realized I was kind of writing a story, so that's what ended up being, talking about internationalism, particularly as it relates to Palestine and Black liberation movement. So internationalism and contemporary struggles have had their roots in the Bandung Conference in 1955, the emergence of the non-aligned movement, and the Cuban Revolution. The rise of leftist revolutionary and guerrilla movements around the world, specifically groups like the Black Panthers, the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, the PFLP, and the ANC in South Africa, were bolstered by each other and by the Cuban revolutionary government, as well as by newly independent nations like Libya under Muammar Gaddafi. Members of these groups trained together in places like Algeria, and they provided reciprocal political and material and tactical support to each other. The mood during these times was one of solidarity, which was a source of strength for all groups fighting their respective battles. And it can be exemplified by the words of Fred Hampton, who said in 1969 in his speech, "Power Anywhere Where There's People," quote, we ain't gonna fight no reactionary pigs. We're gonna organize and dedicate ourselves to revolutionary political power and teach ourselves the specific needs of resisting the power structure, to arm ourselves, and we're gonna fight reactionary pigs with international proletarian revolution. So fast forward to the 1980s and 90s, and we see the fate of these movements, which can be viewed and argued in the context of their respective degrees of adherence to these principles of internationalism. The PLO, which was composed largely of exiled leaders, primarily in Tunisia, started to feel threatened by the emergence of a new leadership that was forming organically inside Palestine during the First Intifada, which started in 1987. Rather than rely on solidarity and internationalism to bolster the younger generation rising up and suffering horrendous Israeli brutality, they chose to leverage the uprising, or the Intifada, in order to make alliances with their oppressors, and thereby abandoned their revolutionary power in favor of entering an imperialist system as what amounts to middle management. They narrowed their focus from the global or internationalist confrontation with capitalism and settler colonialism, to nationalist problem that they thought could be solved by negotiations and agreements with those who oppress Black people and who oppress them. This is, of course, a simplification of complex interwoven events, but I believe it remains valid nonetheless. Likewise, the dissolution of the Black Panther Party was complex, encompassing ideological disagreements among the leadership, infiltration, coercion, surveillance, drugs, assassinations, and more. But one can find in these cascading events an overarching reduction of an international struggle, galvanized by reciprocal solidarity and bolstered by a global united front, to a national and even local focus. The struggle of the ANC, on the other hand, maintained an air of internationalism that globalized the anti-apartheid movement as an international moral struggle. Unlike the PLO, Nelson Mandela refused to negotiate his release. He refused to renounce violence as a means of resistance. In his famous letter from prison, he explained that his decision was because only free men can negotiate. The ANC made a lot of mistakes, particularly after the defeat of the apartheid regime, but their insistence early on global moral principles was the pivotal thing that I believe they got right. So fast forward a couple of decades, as the ANC had already abandoned those principles, much like the PLO, in favor of imperialism's middle management. They capitulated to NATO's bombing of Libya and the murder of Gaddafi, who had been one of the few people, the few nations that stood by the ANC when the world's major powers had actually been against them. Other African nations likewise made alliances with the West during that time, and they watched as one of Africa's most generous, stable, and prosperous nations was reduced to ash, lawlessness, and unspeakable, pervasive violence. So by the 2000s, that spirit of righteous internationalist alliances against imperialism was all but gone. In 2011, the same year that Gaddafi was murdered, I was in Gaza speaking to activists and local citizens in various venues throughout the besieged enclave. One of the things that we ended up discussing at length was their concept of the world. There was discussion about the world's silence, about how they can make their voices heard to the world, etc. And there was a silence when I pointed out that, in fact, the world is standing with us. Only the West is supporting Israel. Anyway, I wrote a couple of essays after that trip, and I want to read one excerpt from one of the essays under a subheading called Natural Allies. In Black Skin, White Mask, Frantz Fanon described the narcissism of inferiority that results from white colonization and enslavement of blacks. He said, "Black men want to prove to white men at all costs the richness of their thought, the equal value of their intellect," unquote. This single sentence describes the Anglo-centric nature of Palestinian discourse with the world. The conversation we have with Europe and white America is one in which we are always trying to prove our humanity, one in which we beg for acceptance and solidarity, and one from which we accept the various sympathies of a white man's burden as if it were true solidarity, or something of a slice of bread that comes with an admonition that we have not behaved well. This is not to say that true solidarity has not come from white individuals. I would not deny the love and sacrifices of men and women like Rachel Corrie, Tom Herndal, Vittorio Arrigoni, and many more. I do not deny the kind of solidarity that transcends ethnicity. But there is an undeniable difference in the way peoples of different ethnicities relate to us. With Africans, including African descendants of those who were enslaved, there is no need to preface our words. There is never a sense that we need to prove our worth or righteousness or the righteousness of our struggle for liberation. This is what I mean by, quote, natural allies. They are people who know viscerally what it means to be regarded as vermin by most of the world, those who know what it is to be the wretched of the earth. And then in the essay, I went on to recount the solidarity I had encountered on a trip I had made to Venezuela a couple years before that, and then the year prior to that to Durban, South Africa. And I enumerated the most vociferous champions of our cause, most of whom are Africans, South Americans, and African Americans. And I concluded with a call to internationalism, and this is also from the essay. Because there is a kind of liberation that can only come from being a part of the liberation of others, and because fostering reciprocal human solidarity is how we break an oppressor's imposed isolation, such as the siege of Gaza. Because the United States and Europe are not our friends, they have never been our friends. The essay was published on the Electronic Intifada, and I was later told that it had been their single most viewed page that year. It spurred a great deal of discussion and a good deal of backlash as well, against me personally even, largely from Black cultural nationalists who didn't appreciate the comparisons between the Palestinian and Black struggles. Fast forward again to 2014. Israel mutilated Gaza once again, and just a few weeks later, Mike Brown was murdered and his uncovered body was left to fester in the streets. The initial protests in Ferguson became an uprising when the people refused orders to leave the streets. Palestinian activists were among the first. They were there from the outset. Without question or qualification, they joined protesters at the police station in Ferguson. The most visible point of solidarity happened on Twitter, as Palestinian activists in both the United States and thousands of miles away in Palestine were tweeting to activists in Ferguson advice on how to deal with bullets and tear gas and other militaristic responses, while most of the country and the world sat back and watched Ferguson burn. The day the uprising began, I wrote a statement of solidarity and circulated it among a group of Palestinian activists and intellectuals, and within days it was published with over 100 signatures of prominent Palestinians around the world. And I'm going to read just a small excerpt of that. From all factions and sectors of our dislocated society, we send you our commitment to stand with you in your hour of pain and time of struggle against the oppression that continues to target our Black brothers and sisters in nearly every aspect of their lives. We understand your moral outrage. We sympathize with your hurt and anger. We understand the impulse to rebel against the infrastructure of racist capitalist system that systematically pushes you to the margins of humanity, and we stand with you. What transpired from Ferguson marked a turning point of renewed internationalism and solidarity, which has spurred a great deal of thought and analysis, including solidarity trips both ways. The Dream Defenders team went to Palestine, and Birzeit University students came to the U.S. And books like Angela Davis's Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of a Movement. In an interview with Amy Goodman, Angela Davis, she was talking about her book. She talked about this recent sort of resurgence of internationalism. And this is what she said in talking about young people in these movements. They recognize that it is not possible to effectively create radical consciousness by focusing on a single issue. And whereas many of the movements that challenged police killings in the past focused almost in a myopic way on the prosecution of the individual perpetrator, now these movements are taking on larger questions such as structural racism, institutional racism, state violence, the connection between terrorism and racism, the extent to which the counter or their so-called counter-terrorist ideologies and approaches are transforming the way racism functions, transforming state violence. And so it is so exciting to see the facility with which young activists are able to engage in this intersectionality of struggles. It's about racism, but it's also about homophobia, and it's about transphobia, and it's about addressing ableism. It's about creating a sense of international solidarity. And the extent to which Palestine has become central to efforts against racism in this country is an indication of how important international solidarity has become. Angela Davis also makes the point that capitalism and imperialism are already internationalized. She points to G4S, the third largest corporation in the world, just behind Walmart and Foxconn. G4S owns and operates private prisons throughout the U.S. They're involved in private policing, surveillance, and imprisonment throughout the country and the world, including Palestine. G4S is a vital part of upholding Israel's brutal occupation, just as it is a vital suppression. It is vital to the violent suppression of Black America. And just to bring things back to Cuba and South America, also in 2014, when all of this was happening, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro visited Fidel Castro, after which Fidel Castro wrote a letter entitled True Friendship. It was a short letter for Castro, but it was quite remarkable in illustrating how internationalism remained core to the value of the Cuban Revolution, and more specifically to Castro himself. It was something he never abandoned, and you could see it in that letter. In the letter, he spoke about the colonial slaughter of Gaza that happened that same year, and he talked about what Venezuela did to send aid to Gaza. It wasn't easy for Venezuela to do that, to load up a cargo plane, which they had trouble getting parts from the American manufacturer, and send it then to Egypt, which was in cahoots with Israel and were not allowing an aid. So they had to send one of their ambassadors along with the cargo to negotiate with the Egyptians to ensure that it would be allowed to cross into Gaza. And Fidel talked about this in the letter. Israel was actually quite unhappy with the show of solidarity from Venezuela, and they tried to threaten the Venezuelan delegation by bombing close to where the aid was being delivered to Palestinians. The Venezuelan ambassador to Egypt said it was a, quote, act of intimidation which is not a coincidence, and it proves that Tel Aviv is trying to halt Palestinian aid, unquote. And I also note that Venezuela refers to them as Tel Aviv and not Jerusalem as the West does, to imply that Jerusalem is their capital, which is not. And more on this incident, and just to demonstrate how capitalism, settler colonialism, and imperialism are intertwined and deeply entrenched in all parts of life. At the same time that Maduro sent aid to Gaza, the Associated Press and the French press agency published articles alleging a lack of medical supplies in Venezuela, presumably with the intent of fomenting unrest among Venezuelans. Fidel mentioned this in his letter and pointed out that this is how they destabilized so many South American nations, including Chile, when they toppled Salvador Allende. Castro went on to say that Israel's genocidal actions have raised awareness among the masses, and this awareness is shifting consciousness toward internationalism. I'm going to close with that thought from the single successful and enduring revolution, which was the Cuban Revolution. And it is really the only revolution that never abandoned its core ethos of creating and maintaining a united front in the face of settler colonial capitalist imperialism. Other groups, like the PLO, the ANC, became mired in the duplicity of concessions that ultimately diminished their power, and I think there's a lesson in that for all of us. Thank you.
I want to congratulate the Saturday Free School for its 5th anniversary, and I think that's a real achievement. Praises to all the organizers, including Tony Montero and the Saturday Free School. The Saturday Free School is extremely important. I look at the Saturday Free School as it reminded me of when Munchie was talking about the boxing gym that he used to go to in South Philly. And to me, the Saturday Free School is like a boxing gym, but for ideas, or a martial arts gym. Because we are in as Fidel Castro said, a battle of ideas, a battle of values, a battle of ideas. And so we're also in a hurricane of bombardment by imperialist ideas and values and propaganda. And so we all need fortification to resist these ideas. And there's no better place. A Saturday Free School is a space where we can develop our ideological fortitude, our ideological weapons to battle this onslaught, this ideological onslaught of Western propaganda. So again, I want to praise the Saturday Free School. My presentation is about that, the battle of ideas. And the battle of ideas in the context of colonialism. So it's titled From Colonial Depersonalization to Cultural Repersonalization, Wielding the Revolutionary African Personality. Let me just tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a Pan-African internationalist, and even by birth, I'm that in a way. My mother is an African American from West Philly. She met my father, who's an African South American from a country called Suriname. He came here to go to school. They met in Philly. They got married. They moved to Aruba, a little island next to Venezuela, and raised a family. I came here when I was a teenager. I've been here the rest of my life. And in the process of that, I joined the organization called the All-African People's Revolutionary Party, which Kwame Ture, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael, was a big leader. So a lot of my ideological training comes with this background. I also attended Lincoln University, HBCU College, where I was during the anti-apartheid movement. We were very active in demonstrating apartheid. So this internationalism is part of my life. And, you know, I've struggled for the unity of black people across the world, and as well as other oppressed people around the world, in the sense of internationalism. So getting back to my presentation, I'm shortening this presentation. I've done before with a PowerPoint presentation, but I have a two-sided handout that goes with it. And if people would like, if somebody would like to pass it out, that's great. So the African personality, because we're going to be talking about culture, deculturalization, and wielding cultural personality. So the African personality started around the 1800s with a brother here called Edward Wilmot Blyden. First of all, even before I go into that though, I want to talk about the dialectical law of reciprocal action, which says that wherever there's oppression in this world, there's going to be resistance. Sometimes you can't see that resistance because it takes the form of ideas, for example. You know, resistance can take different forms. It can take the form of a protest, a sit-in, a rebellion. And so when Africans were brought here to the American shores, North America, South America, the Caribbean, there were rebellions. In the book by Herbert Aptheker, he wrote a book called American Negro Slave Rebellions. He documents over 250 rebellions only right here in the United States. So our people rebelled against oppression from the beginning, you know, physical rebellion. But along with physical rebellion comes ideological rebellion. And so I want to focus on the ideological part of the rebellion. So part of the ideological rebellion, even at the time, was this notion that we as a people were subhuman. You know, we had to fight even against the idea that we were not human. And so this was very elaborately done to dehumanize us, to justify slavery. But it was very elaborately done in pseudo-scientific circles. You know, Fanon talks about it. Others have talked about it. So Edward Blyden, who was a theologian, statesman, and an author, he spent a lot of his time combating these ideas that we as a people were not human, and that we had no culture, we had no history. You know, they always said Africa had no culture, we had no history. And so we were in an ideological onslaught as well as a physical onslaught. So it's ideological oppression as well as the physical. So Edward Blyden spent a lot of his time trying to refute these. There was a man named Count Arthur de Gobineau. He was a Frenchman who wrote a book called The Inequality of the Races. And in this book, he said that there was a hierarchy of races with, of course, Europeans at the top, then, you know, Asians, Arabs, whatever, but Africans were at the bottom. So, these were some of the ideas that were promoted during that time. And even Fanon writes about this. He wrote about this in 1956 at the Conference of Negro Writers held in Paris, an artist. But Edward Blyden, he lived late 1800s, beginning 1900s, and in 1893, he came out with a pamphlet called the African Person, Reasserting the African Personality. So what he meant by this was to reassert that we had a culture as a people, that we were human, and we had a rich history. Because, they were saying we had no history, no culture, so this is what he wrote. He wrote about the African personality. And he also wrote about African values and traditions in Africa. And one of the things he said also is that Africa had a communistic heritage. A lot of cultural nationalists don't even know this, but he talked about the communistic heritage of Africa. And, obviously now we know that socialist principles and ideas and communist principles ideas are therefore very organically linked with Africa's traditional past. Kwame Nkrumah talked about that too. So this is the part, though, that imperialism and slavery and colonialism has damaged and attacked in our culture. So a lot of what I want to talk about in terms of culture, and listening to the other speakers and Tony, I think the concept of culture can be to some degree interchanged with the concept of civilization, because I want to expand on the traditional idea of what culture, of what people understand culture to be. Some of the revolutionaries who really expanded on the idea of culture is what's undergirding this, and those are Frantz Fanon, Kwame Nkrumah, Sékou Touré, Amilcar Cabral, and the like. So, let's see here. So after Blyden came up to discuss the African personality, the African personality gained more of its revolutionary character with people like, I'm looking some of this up on my phone here, with people like Kwame Nkrumah and Sékou Touré, because they developed the revolutionary aspect of the African personality. Yeah, so let's see here. So I want to get to this graphic too to explain it. Some more of the resistance, though, from a Pan-African perspective, in South America, I mentioned Herbert Aptheker's book that had 250 slave rebellions here in the United States. There were many rebellions in the Caribbean and South America as well. And a couple of them, important ones I just want to mention is, of course, the Haitian Revolution, which is a very key revolution because it had a ripple effect and impact all over South America. And speaking of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez and Maduro, they were very conscious of the positive impact the Haitian Revolution had on South America, and that's why they have gone out of their way to help Haiti in so many ways, because the Haitian Revolution gave sanctuary to Venezuelan and Colombian revolutionaries of the time, gave them weapons, gave them food, to wage their wars of independence. And so they're forever grateful to the Haitian Revolution for that. The Haitian Revolution had ripple effects even in this country, and people feared Haiti at that time. So the Haitian Revolution is a very important revolution in terms of resistance and ideological resistance. And another important rebellion is the rebellion in Colombia by Bengos Biojo, which happened also in 1619. And that rebellion resulted in a maroon. You know, in the Afro-Venezuelan network has a term they call cimarronaje, which means marooning, but they've made it into a revolutionary term, which means maintaining and resisting with your culture against the culture of the colonizer. But cimarronaje means refers to maroon societies, which are societies where the Africans escaped slavery and either went into mountains or forest interiors and maintained their own communities independent of the slave societies. So those communities are in many places in South America. Colombia has one in San Basilio de Palenque, and the country where my father comes from has actually the largest, which is Suriname. They have 60,000 Maroons still in the rainforest who have maintained African culture. So I'm just saying all this to say, and then there's Brazil, of course, with Zumbi of Palmares. But wherever there's oppression, there's resistance. So we have to look now for ideological resistance as well. The revolutionary African personality developed this revolutionary character with Kwame Nkrumah, Sékou Touré, Amilcar Cabral, Frantz Fanon, Malcolm X, and Steve Biko. All of them contributed to the revolutionary African personality. I want to highlight, though, mostly Nkrumah, Sékou Touré, and Fanon. Frantz Fanon said in Black Skin, White Mask, the creation of an inferiority complex in every colonized people is a result of a process inherent in colonialism, which involves the death and burial of its local cultural originality as a result of its encounter with the culture of the colonizing country. And so Fanon is studied so widely around the world because colonized people all over experience this. You know, and that's common to all places that experience colonialism, especially settler colonialism. As Fanon also said, as a psychoanalyst, I should help my patient to become conscious of his unconscious and abandon his attempts at hallucinatory whitening, but also to act in the direction of a change in the social structure. So not only did Fanon talk about, you know, transforming our thinking in terms of, you know, loving ourselves, loving our own cultural personality, and not being, you know, so inclined to hallucinatory whitening. But he also understood that this was going to require a qualitative change in the political economic structure of the whole system. In other words, Fanon said, the black man should no longer be confronted by the dilemma, turn white or disappear. Fanon felt that a proper analysis of the inferiority complex was the key to its destruction, and he analyzed some of the resulting symptoms of inferiority complex as being the colonized tries to intimidate the oppressor. The colonized tries to imitate the oppressor. The colonized try to de-racialize themselves, that is to deny oneself as a different race, thereby denying one's personality. The colonized try to assume the cultural personality of the oppressor. The colonized try to go through a process of alienation. I should say the colonized go through a process of alienation culturally. see, Malcolm also spoke about the need for Africans to repersonalize themselves when he told Africans in America, you showed me one of these people over here who've been thoroughly brainwashed and has a negative attitude towards Africa, and I'll show you one who has a negative attitude towards themselves. Steve Biko as well spoke on it. He said, it becomes more necessary to see the truth as it is if you realize that the only vehicle for change are these people who have lost their personality. The first step, therefore, is to make the black man come to himself, to pump back life into his empty shell, to infuse him with pride and dignity, to remind him of his complicity in the crime of allowing himself to be misused and therefore letting evil reign supreme in the country of his birth. This is what we mean by an inward-looking process, this definition of black consciousness. And, you know, when Tony was talking about white supremacy, I think South Africa really has a very similar situation as Africans do in this country here. And Steve Biko was really feeling that white supremacy and the effect it had on our people in South Africa. Sekou Touré develops the African personality and character. This cultural revolution constitutes the bonds of our unity after so many centuries of attempts at dis-Africanization. It is this cultural revolution which will re-Africanize us. So, you know, this is what you find under colonialism all over the world. It's part of the colonizer's job to, if it's India, to dis-Indianize you, or if it's Africa, to dis-Africanize you, you know? So the revolutionary reaction to that, part of it, not all of it, but part of it is to refine your own culture, you know, refine aspects of your own culture that, as Fanon said, have been mummified under colonialism. So that's part of the reassertion of the cultural personality of any people who've undergone colonialism. I want to hurry up and get to the graphic. So we come here to understand this handout that I passed out, and this is rooted in the theory of Nkrumah and Touré mostly. Okay, so we have to come to a definition of culture. And this definition of culture is so embracing. It's like the equivalent of civilization, I'm thinking. Okay, so Sekou Touré says culture includes all the material and immaterial works of art and science, plus knowledge, manners, education, a mode of thought, behavior, and attitudes accumulated by the people, both through and by virtue of their struggle for freedom from the whole and dominion of nature. We also include the result of their efforts to destroy deviationist politics, social systems of domination and exploitation through the productive process of social life. So culture is everything that encompasses human interaction with nature and with other human beings, essentially. So now we come to the definition of ideology, which is not on this handout, but that was the oversight. But I'm going to read it to you now, and this comes from Nkrumah, I know Brandon in the back there has already mentioned this in the Saturday school. So in the book Conscientism, Nkrumah offers several defining characteristics of ideology, which can be summarized in the following way. Nkrumah says the ideology of a society is total, and it displays itself in political theory, economic theory, social theory, and moral theory, and it uses these as instruments and principles guiding a behavioral code of conduct. Ideology aims at uniting the actions of millions of people towards specific goals, although an ideology can be largely implicit. So that means it doesn't have to be written down for it to be an ideology. Ideologies are not necessarily a body of ideas written down on paper, and the fact that it may not be does not prevent it from being one. A revolutionary ideology does not merely express that a present social order be abolished. It also seeks to defend a social order that it introduces. So now we come to the combining of the two concepts, culture and ideology, and Choudhry elaborates here beautifully on this, and he says, people create culture and ideology simultaneously. To each culture corresponds an ideology. Culture and ideology are reciprocally reinforcing and in dialectical motion. Ideology is the immaterial aspect of culture. The consumption of culture simultaneously involves the ingestion of ideology, since ideology is contained in culture. Ideology, in turn, acts upon the people in the culture. Most societies have competing cultures and ideologies, but at any given time, only one is dominant. The dominant ideology is that of the dominant group, i.e., oppressor versus oppressed, revolutionary versus counter-revolutionary, colonizer versus colonized, etc. And Nkrumah says even societies that do not have contending ideologies, social contention is always present in the society. So there we get to, that was the back of the pyramid, the cultural pyramid the graphic that I have here. And this is an incomplete graphic, but it has some aspects in it that according to the Nkrumah ideology, are necessary. For example, the material base of culture and civilization are the forces and mode of production. And, the whole cultural pyramid is the container of and ideology is its contents, which Choudhry says. And underneath it, it explains what the forces of production are, and those are the working masses, including their tools and technology and knowledge, and the mode of production, which characterizes the class relationships people have with one another, which is conditioned by who owns and controls what is produced and whether the majority own or a minority own. Now, in this pyramid, you see the thick lines are on the outside, the thin lines are on the inside. So the thin lines are porous lines, and they're infused with ideology running all over it. So the mode of production and the forces of production are the bottom material base, but ideology emanates from that, and it goes to universal culture, and at the top is the cultural personality that Cabral, Touré, and Fanon talk about. But now the pyramid is also split in half, and on the right side you see the influence of counter-revolutionary, reactionary culture and ideology, and on the left side you see revolutionary and progressive culture and ideology. Now, of course, I wish that society was split exactly 50-50, but it's almost never like that, because like Nkrumah said, one is always dominant. And since we live majority in an oppressive world by white supremacy and capitalism, the right side of this pyramid is always almost all the way 180 degrees, taking up this pyramid. But again, according to the dialectical law, wherever there's oppression, there's resistance. And our people's resistance takes the form of values, first of all. Like we were reading in Du Bois's book, Souls of Black Folk, about a woman named Josie, and how her values and morals were so strong, So, like Kwame Ture used to say, capitalism not only tries to control your labor and your resources, more importantly, it tries to control your thinking and your ideas and your morals. And so this is the battle of ideas. This is the arena of the battle of ideas, exemplified by this pyramid, which is how we're trying to practice wielding revolutionary ideas in the Saturday school. And it starts with, just basic morals and values. Capitalism attacks people's morals and values. White supremacy attacks these values. So we have to fortify ourselves first with morals and values as part of that. And then it goes into, like Nkrumah said, political theory, moral theory, social theory, economic theory, and he also says philosophy is an instrument of ideology. Then you can add, of course, racism, white supremacy. That can be penciled in on the right side. That's part of counter-revolutionary ideology and culture. So, and then you can add, other intersectional identities, etc. So, with that, I'm going to conclude just with a brief conclusion here on the integrity of the revolutionary African personality. The African personality is the product of the evolution of African people's conception of the world, way of life, their ethics, their moral principles, which are a particular reflection of African culture. This African cultural personality continues to be under attack by capitalism and colonialism, racism, sexism, and its extension, neocolonialism, which have developed in diverse and sometimes subtle ways of moral, intellectual, and cultural aggression towards us as an oppressed people. We are clear that the assertion of the cultural personality of an oppressed culture becomes the catalyst for its national liberation movement. That's Cabral saying that. Nkrumah and Touré both called for the revival and integrity of the African personality. It is this repersonalization which constitutes the successful affirmation of the cultural personality of the oppressed people. Repersonalization for Africans means re-Africanization to be accomplished only through the cultural revolution. Nkrumah says that the revolutionary African personality expresses identification not only with Africa's past, but with the struggle of African people in the African Revolution to liberate and unify the continent to build a just society. Thank you.
So Yvonne King can't be here today, so I'm gonna read, she's in West Africa. So I'm gonna read what she would have written here by Yvonne King, okay? Internationalism and the consolidation of revolutionary consciousness in Cuba and Angola. The Cuban Revolution is one of the best examples of internationalism. On December 5th, 1988, Fidel Castro reminded 500,000 Cubans in Havana that being internationalist is paying your debt to humanity. Those who are incapable of fighting for others will never be capable of fighting for themselves. Cuba's internationalism is characterized by both military aid and humanitarian assistance. In addition to Latin America, the Cuban Revolution responded to a myriad of requests from liberation movements in Africa, which began in 1961, when Cuba sent a shipload of weapons to the Algerians who were fighting for the independence from France. After winning independence the following year, Cubans sent medical personnel in 1963. From 1966 to 1974, Cuba helped Amilcar Cabral's African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde, also known as the PAIGC, helped win Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde's freedom from Portugal. The Cubans laid landmines, trained the freedom fighters, and fought with them. One of the PAIGC commanders said about the Cubans, quote, "Here were men who crossed the ocean to come to our aid. They lived with us, they shared in our sacrifices," end quote. Another said, quote, "The Cubans were very brave. They endured everything. They ate what we ate. We did everything together," end quote. The Cubans were the only foreigners Cabral allowed to fight with his soldiers. Cuba's internationalism in Africa extended to Ethiopia and Mozambique and other countries, but none will have the lasting impact on Africa and increasingly on the world as the almost 16 years of assistance given to the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, MPLA, and the Angolan people from 1975 to 1991. The result of that relationship was Cuba's contribution to defending Angola's sovereignty and territorial integrity, Namibia winning its independence from South Africa, and inspiring South African revolutionaries to be resolute in fighting the South African armed forces, who, before their defeat in Angola, were considered to be invincible. But what impact did those many years in Angola have on the Cuban Revolution, and in what ways did Cuba benefit? It wasn't just the 337,033 Cuban soldiers, the almost 50,000 civilian internationalists, and the 2,077 Cuban men and women who paid the ultimate sacrifice during the war against Angolan rebels who were aided by the United States, South Africa, and US-backed Zaire and Israel. Fidel shared in his autobiography, there were millions of men and women in Cuba who ensured the success of every mission by dedicating more hours of work for those who traveled abroad in the internationalist mission. Millions who strove to see that the families of the combatants or civilian support personnel lacked for nothing. Now, let us fast forward to April 25th, 1974, when a successful coup against Portugal's fascist dictator occurred. The new government granted independence for all of its African colonies, including Angola, and agreed to hand over power to the strongest organization in each country. This was not as straightforward in Angola as it was in Guinea-Bissau and Mozambique, where the PAIGC and the Frelimo, respectively, were the obvious recipients. In Angola, there were three competing organizations: the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, the MPLA, who had the widest support of the people, the National Front for the Liberation of Angola, FNLA, and the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, UNITA. On January 15th, 1975, the Alvor Agreement was signed by representatives of the MPLA, FNLA, UNITA, and the Portuguese government granting Angola independence on November 11th, 1975. The three Angolan organizations agreed to participate in a coalition government with representatives from all. However, the agreement did not hold because each of the organizations wanted to rule the country. Consequently, the fight for control of Luanda began. Whoever controlled the capital would control independent Angola. NIDO had a strong base for support in Luanda, but would they be able to defend it? On October 14, 1975, the United States-backed South Africans invaded Angola by crossing the Namibian border and with UNITA moved north to occupy Luanda by November 11th. Cuban military instructors were in Benguela training the FAPLA forces when the South Africans and UNITA reached a town nearby. Although the Cubans and their students resisted, they were ill-equipped and outnumbered. After suffering Angolan and Cuban casualties, they had to retreat. The 4 instructors were the first that died on Angolan soil. NIDO then asked Cuba to send combat troops. Cuba agreed and named this international military campaign Operation Carlotta, after an African slave who led 2 rebellions against slavery and colonial oppression in Cuba in the 1840s. She was eventually captured and brutally executed in 1843. In addition to paying tribute to Carlotta, Cuba was also paying tribute to the country's Latin African heritage. Operation Carlotta was launched on November 5th, and several days later, a battalion of special forces arrived from Cuba, and an artillery regiment went by ship. What really decided the war in Angola was a battle at a small town in the south of the country called Cuito Carnaval. The Angolan troops had to retreat to this town after heavy pursuits by the South African forces. The Cubans increased their troops to more than 50,000, sent in hundreds of tanks, their best pilots, modern planes, and anti-aircraft weapons. The Southwest African People's Organization, SWAPO, who was fighting for the liberation of Namibia from South Africa, had bases in southwest Angola, knew the terrain, and accompanied the Angolans and Cubans. Their offensive broke the morale of the South African troops and drove their politicians to the United Nations in December 1988 to sign peace accords with representatives from Angola, the United States, and the Cuban Revolution. The more than 300,000 Cuban military volunteers and almost 50,000 civilians were multi-generational, including those who were born after the revolution took power in 1959, so they had not experienced life under capitalism. Luis Alfonso Zayas, an international volunteer in Angola who headed the civilian mission in Cabinda, consisting of 600 Cuban internationalists. Among them were doctors, teachers, construction workers, and others. He recalled in an interview in 2011, Cuban doctors have gone to places where people have never seen a doctor, where they may have just enough food to survive but die from lack of basic medical attention. For everyone who has gone on these missions, the kind of experience is extremely important. It creates a consciousness different from what they had done before. They go places where even news doesn't arrive because there are no means of communication, neither radio nor television. Simple survival is the aim. Living that reality helps mold our consciousness. Cuban volunteers on internationalist missions in other countries are learning what Cuba used to be like. They're learning about capitalism, about the exploitation of man by man. So it's not only about helping, we also receive. Zayas also acknowledged that Cuba is not perfect when he made the following point. It's not that there are no problems in Cuba today, but when young Cubans go on internationalist missions, they see the reality in these places firsthand, and that gives them a clear understanding of what the revolution changed in Cuba. In 1998, the Clinton administration railroaded Geraldo Hernandez, Fernando Gonzalez, Rene Gonzalez, Antonio Guerrero, and Ramon Labino on charges of espionage and murder. 5 Cubans who were monitoring the activities of counter-revolutionary organizations that were planning attacks on Cuba. They were giving sentences ranging from 15 years for Rene to double life for Geraldo. 3 of the 5, Geraldo Hernandez, Fernando, and Rene Gonzalez, served in Angola. In 2012, from his prison cell in Tierra Hat, Indiana, Fernando Gonzalez talked about his 2-year, 1987 to 1989, experience in southern Angola by recognizing that they, quote, they were of enormous importance for my development as a revolutionary and as a human being. It was an honor for a young revolutionary to go to Angola and be part of that effort. I learned a lot from the Cubans and Angolans. I learned from their camaraderie and solidarity under difficult conditions. From the collective team effort that prevailed despite cultural differences between the Cubans and the Angolan combatants, and the richness those very differences brought us. We learned from each other. In Angola, I learned from both Angolans and Cubans that no matter how much training you may have received, certain things are more important for a revolutionary. The development of character, sensitivity as a human being, a spirit of solidarity. I learned more by seeing with my own eyes the effect of colonialism and its consequences for a people than I did from all the books I had studied or could have studied. I saw the fighting spirit of the Angolan people and their determination to overcome the past, their efforts to repel foreign aggression and defeat the foreign-backed counter-revolutionaries. That was a lesson I was drawn, withstanding conditions of prolonged imprisonment. Clearly, the international mission in Angola strengthened the Cuban Revolution. One Cuban observed that such life experience means more than 100 classes from a manual or Marxism. They saw the lack of education, sanitary conditions, and healthcare in Angola. They saw how in such a country rich with natural resources as Angola, the Angolans were exploited and impoverished. one of the Cubans who fought in the 1956 to 1958 revolutionary struggle that defeated Batista and went on multiple international missions, said about Angola, quote, "This experience has helped all of us develop politically and ideologically. But within Cuba, it enabled us to consolidate the political and ideological development of the young people who went to fight and to assist other peoples who understood the justice of their cause and were proud of their mission." In describing the international combatants, Raul Castro, in his speech on May 27, 1991, at the ceremony to receive the final contingent for Cubans from Angola, "It was an army of the masses, a revolutionary army of the people, from all generations that are active today in the Cuban process, from rebel army veterans to the youngest recruits and reserve members." We should embrace Fidel's definition of internationalism, paying one's debt to humanity. As revolutionaries, let us never forget the central motivation in the revolutionary process is the people, whether at home or abroad.
All right, thank you. That concludes our panel. I think we're going to transition to a coffee break.
A big thank you to the panelists. I'm sorry we have no time for questions. You want to say something?
Yeah.
I just wanted to make one correction. It was Mumia who stood there and made a speech in 1969 in memorial, in honor of Fred Hampton. So, yeah.
Okay, there's coffee at the back. We're going to break for 10 minutes, and then we're going to have Anita read out the words of James Baldwin. You don't want to miss this. She's an actor.
I met her in a class, a reading group that I was a part of on W.E.B. Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk. And she has kindly consented to read from James Baldwin's phenomenal essay entitled Down at the Cross, subtitled A letter from a region of my mind. So without further ado, Anita Holland.
I'll be reading probably about 5 different excerpts. So here we go. It is certainly sad that the awakening of one's senses should lead to such a merciless judgment of oneself, to say nothing of the time and anguish one spends in the effort to arrive at any other. But it is also inevitable that a literal attempt to mortify the flesh should be made among black people, like those with whom I grew up. Negroes in this country, and Negroes do not, strictly or legally speaking, exist in any other, are taught really to despise themselves from the moment their eyes open on the world. This world is white, and they are black. White people hold the power, which means that they are superior to blacks. Intrinsically, that is. God decreed it so. And the world has innumerable ways of making this difference known and felt and feared. Long before the Negro child perceives this difference, and even longer before he understands it, he has begun to react to it. He has begun to be controlled by it. Every effort made by the child's elders to prepare him for a fate from which they cannot protect him causes him, secretly, in terror, to begin to await, without knowing that he is doing so, his mysterious and inexorable punishment. He must be good, not only in order to please his parents, and not only to avoid being punished by them, but behind their authority stands another, nameless and impersonal, infinitely harder to please and bottomlessly cruel. And this filters into the child's consciousness through his parents' tone of voice as he is being exhorted, punished, or loved. In this sudden, uncontrollable note of fear heard in his mother's or father's voice when he has strayed far beyond some particular boundary. He does not know what that boundary is, and he can get no explanation of it, which is frightening enough, but the fear he hears in the voices of his elders is more frightening still. The fear that I heard in my father's voice, for example, when he realized that I really believed I could do anything a white boy could do, and had every intention of proving it, was not at all like the fear I heard when one of us was ill, or had fallen down the stairs, or had strayed too far from the house. No, it was another fear. A fear that the child, in challenging the white world's assumptions, was putting himself in the path of destruction. The summer wore on, and things got worse. I became more guilty and more frightened, and kept all this bottled up inside me, and naturally, inescapably, one night, when this woman had finished preaching, everything came roaring, screaming, crying out, and I fell to the ground before the altar. It was the strangest sensation I had ever had in my life, up to that time or since. I had not known that it was going to happen, or that it could happen. One moment I was on my feet, singing and clapping, and at the same time working out in my head the plot of a play I was working on. Then, the next moment, with no transition, no sensation of falling, I was on my back, with the lights beating down into my face and all the vertical saints above me. I did not know what I was doing down so low or how I had got there, and the anguish that filled me cannot be described. It moved in me like one of those floods that devastate counties, tearing everything down, tearing children from their parents and lovers from each other, and making everything an unrecognizable waste. All I really remember is the pain, the unspeakable pain. It was as though I were yelling up to heaven, and heaven would not hear me. And if heaven would not hear me, if love could not descend from heaven to wash me, make me clean, then utter disaster was my portion. Yes, it does indeed mean something unspeakable to be born in a country, a white country, an Anglo-Teutonic anti-sexual country, black. You very soon, without knowing it, give up all hope of communion. Black people mainly look down or look up, but do not look at each other, not at you. And white people mainly look away. And the universe is simply a sounding drum. There is no way whatever, so it seemed then and has sometimes seemed since, to get through a life, to love your wife and children, or your friends, or your mother and father, or to be loved. The universe, which is not merely the stars and the moon and the planets, flowers, grass, and trees, but other people, has evolved no terms for your existence, has made no room for you, and if love will not swing wide the gates, no other power will or can. And if one despairs, as who has not, of humans' love, God's love alone is left. But God, and I felt this even then, so long ago on that tremendous floor, unwillingly, is white. And if his love was so great, and if he loved all his children, why were we, the blacks, cast down so far? Why? In spite of all I said thereafter, I found no answer on the floor. Not that answer, anyway. And I was on the floor all night. Over me to bring me through, the saints sang and rejoiced and prayed. And in the morning when they raised me, they told me that I was saved. White Americans find it as difficult as white people elsewhere do to divest themselves of the notion that they are in possession of some intrinsic value that black people need or want. And this assumption, which, for example, makes the solution to the Negro problem depend on the speed with which Negroes accept and adopt white standards, is revealed in all kinds of striking ways. From Bobby Kennedy's assurance that a Negro can become president in 40 years, to the unfortunate tone of warm congratulation with which so many liberals address their Negro equals. It is the Negro, of course, who is presumed to have become equal. An achievement that not only proves the comforting fact that perseverance has no color, but also overwhelmingly corroborates the white man's sense of his own value. Alas, this value can scarcely be corroborated in any other way. There is certainly little enough in the white man's public or private life that one should desire to imitate. White men, at the bottom of their hearts, know this. Therefore, a vast amount of energy that goes into what we call the Negro problem is produced by the white man's profound desire not to be judged by those who are not white, not to be seen as he is, and at the same time, a vast amount of the white anguish is rooted in the white man's equally profound need to be seen as he is, to be released from the tyranny of his mirror. All of us know, whether or not we are able to admit it, that mirrors can only lie, that death by drowning is all that awaits one there. It is for this reason that love is so desperately sought and so cunningly avoided. Love takes off the masks that we fear we cannot live without, and we know we cannot live within. I use the word love here not merely in the personal sense, but as a state of being, or a state of grace. Not in the infantile American sense of being made happy, but in the tough and universal sense of quest and daring and growth. And I submit, then, that the racial tensions that menace Americans today have little to do with real antipathy. On the contrary, indeed, and are involved only symbolically with color. These tensions are rooted in the very same depths as those from which love springs, or murder. The white man's unadmitted and apparently to him unspeakable private fears and longings are projected onto the Negro. The only way he can be released from the Negro's tyrannical power over him is to consent, in effect, to become black himself, to become a part of that suffering and dancing country that he now watches wistfully from the heights of his lonely power and, armed with spiritual traveler's checks, visits surreptitiously after dark. How can one respect, let alone adopt, the values of a people who do not, on any level whatever, live the way they say they do, or the way they say they should? I cannot accept the proposition that the 400-year travail of the American Negro should result merely in his attainment of the present level of the American civilization. I am far from convinced that being released from the African witch doctor was worthwhile if I am now, in order to support the moral contradictions and spiritual aridity of my life, expected to become dependent on the American psychiatrist. It is a bargain I refuse. The only thing white people have that black people need or should want is power, and no one holds power forever. White people cannot, in the generality, be taken as models of how to live. Rather, the white man himself is in sore need of new standards, which will release him from his confusion and place him once again in fruitful communion with the depths of his own being. And I repeat, the price of the liberation of the white people is the liberation of the blacks. The total liberation in the cities, in the towns, before the law, and in the mind. Why, for example, especially knowing the family as I do, I should want to marry your sister is a great mystery to me. But your sister and I have every right to marry if we wish to, and no one has the right to stop us. If she cannot raise me to her level, perhaps I can raise her to mine. The American Negro has the great advantage of having never believed that collection of myths to which white Americans cling, that their ancestors were all freedom-loving heroes, that they were born in the greatest country the world has ever seen, or that Americans are invincible in battle and wise in peace, that Americans have always dealt honorably with Mexicans and Indians and all other neighbors or inferiors, that American men are the world's most direct and virile, and that American women are pure. Negroes know far more about white Americans than that. It can almost be said, in fact, that they know about white Americans what parents, or anyways mothers, know about their children, and that they very often regard white Americans that way. And perhaps this attitude, held in spite of what they know and have endured, helps to explain why Negroes on the whole, and until lately, have allowed themselves to feel so little hatred. The tendency has really been, insofar as this was possible, to dismiss white people as the slightly mad victims of their own brainwashing. One watched the lives they led. One could not be fooled about that. One watched the things they did and the excuses that they gave themselves, and if a white man was really in trouble, deep trouble, it was to the Negro's door that he came. And one felt that if one had had that white man's worldly advantages, one would never have become as bewildered and as joyless and as thoughtlessly cruel as he. The Negro came to the white man for a roof, or for $5, or for a letter to the judge. The white man came to the Negro for love. But he was not often able to give what he came seeking. The price was too high. He had too much to lose. And the Negro knew this too. When one knows this about a man, it is impossible for one to hate him. But unless he becomes a man, becomes equal, it is also impossible for one to love him. Ultimately, one tends to avoid him, for the universal characteristic of children is to assume that they have a monopoly on trouble, and therefore a monopoly on you. Ask any Negro what he knows about the white people with whom he works, and then ask the white people with whom he works what they know about him. When I was very young, and was dealing with my buddies in those wine and urine-stained hallways, something in me wondered, what will happen to all that beauty? For black people, though I am aware that some of us, black and white, do not know it yet, are very beautiful. And when I sat at Elijah's table and watched the baby, the women, and the men, and we talked about God's or Allah's vengeance, I wondered, when that vengeance was achieved, what will happen to all that beauty then? I could also see that the intransigence and ignorance of the white world might make that vengeance inevitable. A vengeance that does not really depend on and cannot really be executed by any person or organization, and that cannot be prevented by any police force or army. Historical vengeance, a cosmic vengeance, based on the law that we recognize when we say whatever goes up must come down. And here we are, at the center of the ark, trapped in the gaudiest, most valuable, and most improbable water wheel the world has ever seen. Everything now, we must assume, is in our hands. We have no right to assume otherwise. If we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious blacks, who must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of the others, do not falter in our duty now, we may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. If we do not now dare everything, the fulfillment of that prophecy recreated from the Bible in a song by a slave is upon us. God gave Noah the rainbow sign. No more water. Fire next time.
This one is Wise. Nobody Knows the Trouble I Seen by Baraka Amiri. Traditional. If you ever find yourself somewhere lost and surrounded by enemies who won't let you speak in your own language, who destroy your statues and instruments, who ban your boom, ba-boom, then you are in trouble, deep trouble. They ban your own boom, ba-boom. You in deep, deep trouble, Probably take you several hundred years to get out. And this is called Carry-On Baggage that I wrote. Drone uniforms to fly drones. Bleed me because penetration replaced love. Pop cultures are vultures. Behind them are waxing and wanings of terrible realms. Behind the door, erasing dreams to make it seem like we can live efficiently. Humans are obscene. Emily Dickinson, obscene. A cultural sensation for each invasion, often resurrected. Pain is transformation.